Good grief. Okay, a little bit more fumbling than
usual on these starting here. Okay, this is going to be a quick recap of the discussion for This Is Just to Say, the poem This Is Just to Say. Basically, the purpose of this is to point out some important things that I think were said during the discussion. And if you're going to write about this poem, I think you need to take into account everything I say in this video. Okay, so I will sort of hold you accountable for knowing what it is that I've said in this video. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go to my slideshow. Okay, and I picked out from the discussion I liked a lot Victoria's post, so I kind of cut and pasted it here because it had a lot of interesting things, and I want to use that as kind of like the starting point for my discussion of this. So I asked what kind of person would say this, and Victoria had multiple answers. So she said, someone who is apologetic for their actions would speak like this. And the supporting quote is, forgive me. This person is asking, using the words that are asking for an apology, and so that would, technically make them apologetic. This next one I liked a lot, though. Someone who is trying to stir up trouble for the fun of it. This is just to say, and I like that's an interesting thing to focus on is the title of the poem. Okay, it's kind of it's easy to notice, but it's something that actually bears thinking about. There's a lot going on there, and I think Victoria's onto something there when she says that the title of the poem sort of signals the kind of mischievousness of the piece, the provocation, that the poem in some ways is kind of a provocation. For example, the person who's saying this is bragging about what they have that the others do not. They were so sweet and so cold, the last thing said, about the poems that got eaten. Plums, not poems. Can't eat a poem. Can't eat a poem. Someone who does not care about another person's intentions, which you were saving for breakfast. Okay, so this person knew what the other person wanted to do with this poem, but did not care enough to not eat them themselves. Okay. And this is another really great one. Someone who likes to share about personal experiences. I have eaten the plums. There's something about any sort of writer type who, if they're writing about their own life experiences, there's something about that. There has to be some kind of drive to tell other people about what's happened to you, what you've done, things like that. It's not everyone goes around with that desire, is to let other people know. And so that was a very good observation. And then finally, Victoria said, someone who likes plums. Okay, and because they were delicious, so sweet and so cold, and that's definitely true. That was a very good, excellent point there at the end there. Okay, and so use what Victoria said here to sort of structure a quick set of comments I'd like to make about the poem, and so I'd like to go stanza by stanza. So I loved what Victoria said about stirring it up in the title. This is just to say. Notice also something that, unlike most other poems, notice how if you were reading this poem out loud, you would definitely want to include, I think, the title when you read it. Because you notice how the title of the poem could very easily be the first line of the poem. Think about what if this poem were called A Note, and what now counts as the title would be part of the note, all right? It's an interesting possibility. Sonia has done some research and found someone on the internet who said that the poem originally had been a note, and that it got mistaken for a poem. That's not the story I heard. I mean, what it is, I heard that it was originally a note, like that the poet William Carlos Williams, who was a physician. Okay, so he was a working man. He was not a poet that sat up in his garret and stared out the window and sighed deeply 24 hours a day. He had to go out in the world and work. And he had a wife who was a stay-at-home wife that supported
him on the household end and put up with a lot of his. If you read the biographies, you put up with a whole bunch from him. He was not a good husband, and so this is an actual note that he left for his wife. Okay, but the story I heard and I believe is that he knew perfectly well that what he was doing could count as a poem, and he himself, after he'd done it, was so pleased with what he'd done that he treated it as a poem. He's the one that submitted it for publication and had it put into books that he was gathering for his poetry. Okay, so and then number 3, there was a discussion of excuse me, the term icebox. Icebox is a marker, not of place, like some people over here call it an icebox, but we call it this, but we here call it something else. It's a marker of time. Up until the 1930s, only like going back to the 19th century, there was no electricity and no electrical refrigeration. So when you wanted to cool something, what you had an insulated box, a cabinet, could kind of look in some ways like a refrigerator, but there'd be a compartment where you'd stick a piece of ice in it that would cool the thing down. It actually worked very much like a picnic cooler would these days, only it was a permanent piece of your furniture. It was an appliance, as it were, but a non-electrical appliance. My grandmother, who was born like in 1908, I think, something like that, 1906, 1908, she always called it, even after she had a the whole time I knew her, she had a refrigerator. She always called her refrigerator an icebox, and she was from Canada. I don't know if that makes much of a difference. Okay, but and some of you looked that up. Now I think that then the key thing here, though, is to show you run across a word that you're unfamiliar with. Do some searching on it. Look it up in a dictionary. Definitely, first place to go is a dictionary, or maybe look online to see if, and you might find some sources online that are talking specifically about the mention of that word in the poem. Okay. Now Daniel had a couple of really great, the kind of comments that poetry teachers love to hear about the diction of the poem and the sort of the formality of it. So the idea that first line there, I have eaten, and you notice like this is not how someone speaking would say it. If someone speaking would say it, we'd always do the contractions. We'd say I've eaten, or might even say I ate the plums that were in the icebox. And this I have eaten is much more formal. And Daniel pointed out, like in the next stanza, that begins the and which you were probably saving for breakfast, and which is something that someone would never say in conversation. Okay, I can imagine some professorial type, as they were lecturing or explaining something, might use that kind of grammatical construction in their speech, but it's much more formal than conversation. I think what both of those things are is what you could say markers that even though this thing comes off as informal and conversational, it is very much still a written thing. It's something that is written and not spoken. And I would say those I have eaten and which are sort of signs that this is a written thing, not a spoken thing, no matter how it's trying to come off. Courtney talked about how this person was a deliberate type A personality. Victoria said that it was an expressive person, expressive personality. Courtney said this is a deliberate type A personality. And I could see that, especially knowing the biographical information that he was a doctor. I think that's definitely a definite possibility there of him being a type A personality. He doesn't do deliberate in the choices that he's making here. This is not just an accident. He knows exactly what he's doing. And then, which brings us to the last stanza here and the apology portion of the stanza. Okay, and the question is, and this is a number of people mentioned in the discussion, is he sincerely apologetic? Is this a sincere apology? Nicholas pointed out something. As Victoria said, he's bragging here. He's sort of he's talking about how wonderful this thing that he's denied someone else. He's talking about how wonderful that was. That's taunting, Nicholas says that if it was a real apology, he wouldn't go on. Or you think if this was more of an apology, it would end with the words "forgive me," instead of going on afterwards about how delicious and cold they were. Now, some other people pointed out, like Amanda pointed out, that there's some discussion. Is this sarcastic? Is this rude? The tone. What's the tone? What is the tone of this piece? And Amanda pointed out how it's very difficult to read tone in writing, and in speech, when people are talking, it's easy to pick up on tone, but in writing, it's very difficult to identify tone. That is a reason why I strongly, if there's one practical piece of advice I can give you about your writing outside of school, professional writing, in the emails and such, I strongly recommend that students avoid sarcasm, because with tone being so hard to pick up in writing, you could say something that you meant as a joke, but the other person took seriously and was insulted by it. Since reading tone in writing can be tricky, as a practical rule of thumb, the prudent thing to do would be to avoid sarcasm in professional written communication. So it's hard to say if he's sincere or not just based on the tone, although the taunting part of it definitely goes against some kind of deep sincerity there. Which brings us to the last point, his seeming lack of care. He does not care when he goes on to say that the plums that he's denied the other person were delicious, so sweet and so cold. That seems to mean that he doesn't care about that other person's feelings. He doesn't care that they'll be upset to hear how wonderful they were since they didn't get them. Which brings us to another question that I love to ask about this, and you guys picked up on in the discussion. It's what is the relation? Who is the person being spoken to? Notice that this poem seems to have a very specific person speaking, but also a very specific person addressed. The you, the second person here in the poem, is not the reader, it's not me. No one's eaten my plums. I don't have plums in my refrigerator at this time. So it couldn't be me that's addressed, the reader addressed by the you. This is a kind of theatrical situation where there's a person speaking and then another character, almost, as far as the poem's concerned, that's being spoken to. What is the relation then between the speaker and the person being spoken to? It would seem to be something like something intimate. These two people know each other very well. He knows, the speaker knows, sees these plums in the icebox, no note on them whatsoever, no additional information, and he can infer, notice that that's word from the interpretation video that I did before this, he can infer the purpose of those plums. He can infer exactly what the person who put the plums in the icebox wants to do with them. So these two people know each other very well. Some people thought that it could be a family situation. I loved what Courtney said. Courtney said that this sounds like something her sister would say, because that kind of taunting, that kind of insincere, merely formal sort of apology. Knowing if we want to read back to the biographical situation, and I will talk later about how the reasons for and reasons against reading things like this biographically. But if we do use the biographical situation as an example, it could be a husband writing to a wife. And I had one professor say that the great message in this poem is it's a poem about marriage and what kind of thing marriage is, especially people who've been married for a certain amount of time. And a certain intimacy, but also a certain amount of selfishness and the sort of small ways that you hurt each other, the small sort of rudenesses you commit upon each other just from spending all this time being so close to each other. Something along those lines. Sort of this poem could be a snapshot of that. Okay. In closing, I would like to say, or something I should have said at the top, I'm very impressed by how well the class as a whole is doing with the discussions. You guys are doing a really great job with all that. And so, okay, I will talk to you again later.